I'll try to be as clear as possible. I thought about it for a while, and I thought the best strategy was to read the paper I have, because I write in a quite conversational style anyway. And the paper is designed, though it goes into some detail about some philosophical and psychological ideas, it does so without assuming any background knowledge. It explains the reasons for employing those ideas. And the paper is top and tailed with some concrete examples. So what I say through the middle sections of the paper will be illustrated with an example at the end. So it should take me about an hour to get through. Is that okay? Okay. Now I'm navigating two screens here, so I'm hoping that my slides will change. And let me see. Now I need to bring up the paper.
Your slides are changing, so everything can.
Okay, so that's so far so good. So, if speak to me if you want me to stop, because I'm using two screens, so I can't actually see the cameras while I read the paper. So if I'm speaking too fast and you want me to slow down, don't gesture because I won't see it. Shout at me instead.
Okay, duly noted.
Okay. Okay, here we go. So in this paper, I want to make a methodological argument for a particular approach to the interactive study of the category of stigma, and a subsidiary argument, which will be pursued in service of illustrating the main argument while retaining independent import itself. And this subsidiary argument is an argument for the recognition of non-intentional and non-ignorance-based degradation, discreditation, and discrimination, otherwise referred to as stigma. The methodological argument has three stages. I make some what I call grammatical points about the grammar of stigma as a category and shame and the relationship between the two. In doing so, I make the point that stigma is a category, which is often overlooked in the literature, oddly. And then I make a second point about degradation, discreditation, and discrimination as being accomplished in and through interaction, and that being the production side of those phenomena. And then a third point about the study of the production of the phenomena of stigma, that is the degradation, discreditation, and discrimination, that this is done by recovering the Gestalt contexture. Okay, this will become clearer, I'll explain this in the course of the paper, by which stigmatized individuals see the stigmatizing act. This is an immanent or situated project, which not only does not require an external theoretical framework or transcendental argument or similar, but if one were to be employed, that would destroy or disrupt the very phenomena we're trying to get a grip on here. Okay, so some prefatory remarks here. If we want to eradicate stigma, as the UK's 2017 Heads Together campaign was set up to do, then we need to be clear about what it is we're eradicating and how we might go about it. As demonstrated by another high-profile campaign in the UK, which achieved prominence 2 years later, there are certain assumptions that can dominate our thinking and therefore policy, and these might transpire to be ill-founded. In 2019, following the former Welsh rugby union player Gareth Thomas disclosing that he was living with HIV so as to preempt a tabloid newspaper expose, UK HIV support and advocacy organisations such as the National AIDS Trust, NAT, the Terence Higgins Trust, known as THT, and the Association for Health Professionals Working in the Treatment and Care of People Living with HIV, the British HIV Association, known as BEVA, all released statements and launched campaigns some of which were in collaboration with Gareth Thomas. These campaigns were designed to use the moment of increased media coverage for HIV to combat HIV-related stigma. As you can see on the slide, they all had a particular way of going about this. These campaigns shared a framing assumption which went something like this. If people knew the facts about mental illness or the facts about the current state of HIV medicine, then stigma would be eradicated. This is an example of an unfounded assumption that we're tempted to make if we do not have an adequate understanding of the interactive dynamics and content of stigma, understood as a category of acknowledged and acted degradation, discreditation, and discrimination. We might go so far as to give this a label and call it the ignorance fallacy. It's a fallacy because we know that there is widespread ignorance about HIV, but this does not entail the conclusion that this is either the source or cause of HIV-related stigma. To know that HIV now has effective treatment, that people living with HIV and who are receiving treatment can live full, healthy lives with the virus being untransmissible is one thing, but to assume it is the ignorance of these facts that drives instances of HIV-related degradation, discreditation, and discrimination does not necessarily follow. Beaver, Nat, and THT know the facts, as many of us do, but that should not lead us to conclude that ignorance of these facts must be the sole source or even the driving force behind HIV stigma. We should remind ourselves that stigma is a category term for status degrading, discrediting, and discriminatory interactions. And such interactions often have no, indeed can be operative in spite of, in agnostic indifference to, a knowledge base. Indeed, status degrading interactions might be interactions driven by negative value judgments of one party to the interactions, and value judgments can often be formed with resolute indifference to the facts. Motives for discrimination might turn out to be fact-free, fear-based hostility towards people with different lifestyles, taking sides in a culture war, the enactment of moral mythologies, convenient sticks to beat people with to obtain social advantage, tribalism, opportunistic ways of expressing anger, attempts to gain advantage or power over an interlocutor, and such like. Degradation, discreditation, and discrimination can be enacted in interaction without intent and without ignorance. Someone fully aware of the current state of HIV medicine and who would be deeply remorseful if they thought they had acted in a degrading way can still do something which is objectively degrading, discrediting, and discriminating, something stigmatizing. What I want to do in what follows is make a case for the revival of the interactive study of stigma and, more broadly, for a certain type of now neglected sociological social psychology. It's quite interesting historical phenomenon that if you go back to the 1950s and early 1960s, social psychology was part of the same discipline with sociology, and people who worked in social psychology were often sociologists like Garfinkel or Goffman. And then this just seems to disappear out of the picture at some point in the 1960s, such that social psychology textbooks don't even acknowledge the existence of sociological social psychology anymore and interactive study. So we'll make a case for the study of stigma understood as the in situ study of acknowledged enacted degradation, discreditation, and discrimination. This will perhaps involve more reference to a discussion of themes in philosophy of psychology than readers expect, want, or think appropriate. In my defense, I think it necessary to do this work to make this digression because of the current state of stigma research. While Irving Goffman is widely referenced, we seem to have simply forgotten the rationale which underpins a study at the level of interaction. And this, all too often, leads stigma researchers to misrepresent Goffman and misguidedly advocate turning to forms of structural theorizing, and even in some cases, metaphysics. Once we understand why interactive analysis is necessary, that is, it is not just that stigma is social, it is that interaction provides the contexture in which the sense of actions, including linguistic actions, are locally fixed for the participants to those actions, then and only then can we progress to understanding the interactive mechanics, so to speak, of degradation, discreditation, and discrimination. This, it is hoped, will help us avoid committing the ignorance fallacy and leave us better equipped to address the topic of acknowledged enacted degradation, discreditation, and discrimination in its various forms. So we're on to the introduction proper now. That was the preface. Stigma presents a puzzle for the researcher who might reasonably expect to find their phenomenon in the wild. Stigma is both everywhere, and yet it can be difficult to find, at least without some productive or stipulative formal analytic work. What I mean by this is that in the decades that have followed the publication of Goffman's book Stigma in 1963, the topic of stigma has been something of a boom topic in the social sciences, psychology, and health, while at the same time, in ordinary parlance, the term is much less used than this huge and perpetually expanding academic literature and profile might suggest. The volume of academic literature on stigma can be daunting for someone wanting to construct a comprehensive overview, as the many PhD students who write on the topic and who must begin with a literature view will testify. In March, I did a brief Google Scholar search just for papers with stigma in the title, so it wasn't a content search. And in the 15-year period since 2006, over 17,000 papers have been published with stigma in the title. So that just gives you a taste of what a boom topic this is. One can feel some creeping cynicism about what too often feels like an academic stigma industry, albeit a well-meaning one, which runs parallel to, but in the absence of productive or stipulative work, rarely intersects with the testimony and accounts of members. There is, therefore, a little irony in observing that stigma seems to be an attribute in more ways than Goffman is taken to propose in his classic study. Stigma is now something formally attributed to subjects of academic research by professional social, psychological, and health scientists, where the members themselves would, without prompting, often be unlikely to employ the language of stigma or the broader language of stigma studies. The tension we might observe as holding between the huge volume of formal analytic work on stigma and the relative scarcity of the term being put to use unprompted in concrete settings presents something of a problem for social researchers. Because one begins with something that the literature tells you is a pervasive, negative, and destructive social fact, while finding that the cohorts whom that literature depicts as suffering in light of the pervasiveness of that social fact rarely express themselves or testify by employing the term stigma. This raises questions about the status of the putative social fact, if and when considered as a phenomenon. Excuse me. What we have in the case of stigma is an example of an analyst's gloss. The term stigma has currency in academic writing because it has a use there for social researchers as a glossing device. In contrast, the term stigma seems largely redundant for lay members of society, unless they find themselves seeking to make their experiences relevant to a social researcher who has approached them and framed their interests and their questions in the language of stigma. A putatively stigmatized person is far more likely to express or exhibit distress, frustration, anger, embarrassment, or shame, and talk about their experience of discrimination, prejudice, bias, rudeness, aggression, degradation, and so on, than they are to gloss these expressions through use of the word stigma. This is because stigma is A, a category term akin to the term emotion, and B, the category is one of socially produced or interactionally produced, indexical or occasion and context specific phenomena which serve to degrade, discredit, and discriminate. And in doing so, serve as objects for a range of emotional responses. Grammatically speaking, and this when I say grammatically speaking, this is a sort of Wittgensteinian term of art, but all it means really is if you look at the uses of these terms, you can see certain patterns, and that's their grammar. Okay, certain connections that you see in the way they're used. So grammatically speaking, we might say that the general category term stigma stands to emotion as the specific term degradation stands to shame, or insult stands to anger. Stigma is a category of socially produced, enacted, and acknowledged degradations, discreditations, and discriminations. And these serve as the objects for negative emotional responses, such as shame. When we talk of stigma and emotion, we are talking abstractly at the level of general categories. Abstractly speaking, we might say that someone is emotional because they were stigmatized. Non-categorially, specifically and concretely speaking, someone might tell us they feel shame because they were insulted and degraded by their doctor's response to them having disclosed their HIV status. A stigma researcher might respond to my opening observations by remarking, so what? Speaking at the level of categories, at the level of generality, affords us the ability to talk about a range of phenomena which fall within the category. And in fact, Goffman comes close to saying something like this in the final paragraph of his book, when he comments, and I'm quoting Goffman here, "I have argued that stigmatized persons have enough of their situations in life in common to warrant classifying all these persons together for purposes of analysis." End of quote. Goffman makes this point to justify looking at the different types of discrediting work that different cohorts might be subjected to as one analytic category under the heading of stigma, rather than looking at specific categories of stigmatized person based on the object of the stigmatization, such as membership of a discredited group, a disfigurement, or an impediment, and so on. Goffman's policy is okay so far as it goes because his study remains anchored in the interactional production of stigma, and that's what's key here, that's what's crucial. Okay. So the category of stigma in Goffman's work always remains tied to, constrained and enabled by the specifics of interactional relations. However, if we cut the ties that bind the stigma category to its place in interaction, as do many of the contemporary studies which advocate structural analyses of stigma, such as Gamblers from last year, then we cut the category terms adrift from member concepts as those are expressed in their context of use in interaction. Structural accounts, which begin by criticizing interactional approaches, overlook a crucial point about social phenomena and social facts. As researchers, we can treat social facts as abstract entities, which are functional products of the form of analysis, or we can treat them as social phenomena, which are part of the life world of lay members of society who produce, maintain, and repair those phenomena in interaction. If our analysis remains focused on and is shaped by abstract category nouns separated from their sites of production and from the day-to-day work they are employed to do, then our investigation is not of social phenomena, but of methodologically generated abstract concepts. In other words, it is crucial to study social facts in and through their production in interaction, whether that be face-to-face interaction, as primarily interested Goffman, or expanded to also include interaction which is spatially and temporally distanced and facilitated by a medium. Sorry, I've now lost what number slide I'm on because, okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Since the appearance of Goffman's book in 1963, many of those writing on the topic have depicted Goffman Goffman as defining stigma as an attribute, conferring degraded status on the bearer. Fewer commentators have noted what Goffman goes on to write in the second half of the sentence in which he introduces the attribution claim, wherein he qualifies the depiction of stigma as an attribute by remarking, a language of relationships, not attributes, is really needed. This qualification is crucially important because it is the attribute's sense that is relevant, and this sense is not, as Goffman points out, inherent to the attribute, nor the actors, but is the product of the interactive relationships that confer sense on the attribute in specific contexts or situations. Sometimes you find the term attribute used interchangeably with the word mark. Okay, but Goffman's point, Goffman is so explicit about this, but most people commenting on Goffman ignore that second half of the sentence. So they say Goffman defines stigma as a discrediting attribute, when actually he goes on to say it's not the attribute that's important, it's the relations that are important, because the relations are what convert the negative, the discrediting work of the attribute. Indeed, the attribute could work as a sort of membership card, as something that would boost your status in a different context, something else which Goffman makes explicit. Once we acknowledge this, we acknowledge our task, which is to grasp the sense as that is experienced by those members of the interactive setting, in which an attribute is operationalized to degrade, discredit, or discriminate against its bearer. Put more concretely, a person with, for example, a disfigurement, a speech impediment, or perhaps someone who is living with HIV can, and in many cases does, spend much of their lives without feeling degraded in virtue of having been disfigured, having the speech impediment, or living with the HIV virus. While on other occasions, something takes place which serves to give the attribute, the disfigurement, the speech impediment, or the HIV, a status-degrading sense by situating it in a wider network of meaning, in a Gestalt contextual or language game, perhaps. And this operationalizes this specifically degrading sense. The past decade has seen a resurgence of theoretical work on stigma, which has continued to proceed by situating itself with reference to Goffman's work, but has done so by either downplaying or ignoring the basis in interaction, or by criticizing this basis as micro-sociological and apolitical. Such arguments are usually offered as a precursor to proposing that Goffman-style stigma research needs complementing with or even replacing by the introduction of some form of meso, macro, or structural analyses, such as Foucauldian analysis of power structures that one finds in Hannam, Parker, and Aggleton, Marxian analysis of stigma as a cultural and political economy that you find in Tyler and Slater, or the critical realism of Archer and Bhaskar, Frankfurt School critical theory, and Elias figurational sociology that Scambler proposes. In such critiques and such proposals, Goffman is often praised faintly, very faintly, for initiating the contemporary interest in stigma, but is ultimately damned for being apolitical. Explicitly so in Tyler in 2018 and Scambler, for example. This is now widespread critique, which is advanced in influential theory pieces before being passed down to those who want to conduct stigma research. It is, I submit, confused. While we can concede that there might be some grounds for considering, if not entertaining, this charge if we remain with Goffman, though even here it's tenuous. If we switch out Goffman's account of interaction for that initiated by Harold Garfinkel, perhaps inspired by Garfinkel's classic study of the anticipation and negotiation of degradation, discreditation, and discrimination in his account of the passing work done by the transgender woman Agnes, then the microsociology versus macrosociology distinction and the related charge of ignoring structure should ultimately be seen as ill-founded. Of the authors I mentioned just before, Scambler goes into the most detail in seeking to criticize interactional approaches and motivate macro and meso and structural analyses, invoking Lloyd Bhaskara's critical realism and less prominently the Peircean Kantian critical theory of the second and third generation Frankfurt School, Habermas, Apple and Honneth, the people he draws on. He also draws on Elias's figurational sociology. In making his criticism of Goffmanian's interactional approaches, Scambler alludes to Durkheim's aphorism, which is found in the preface to the second edition of the Rules of Sociological Method. And this is usually paraphrased as the objective reality of social facts is sociology's fundamental principle. It's paraphrased just because it's written across two sentences in a sort of awkward way. So it's not easily quotable without paraphrasing. The problem Scambler's account faces is that interactional approaches do not begin and end with Goffman. This problem is amplified when we note that Scambler ignores the discussion of and central place accorded to Durkheim's aphorism by Howard Garfinkel, who in his later writings invoked it as providing an invitation to ethno-methodological focus on interactional production of social facts. However, the more pressing problem with Scambler's line of argument runs deeper, and it's found in the underlying assumptions he brings to his reading of Durkheim. In citing Durkheim's aphorism, Scambler specifically invokes 2 points he takes to be contained therein: Durkheim's holism and Durkheim's empiricism. We'll focus on point 1 here for brevity. But before we do so, it is perhaps more than notable in passing to mention that Scambler's responses to point 2, to Durkheim's demand for empiricism, don't really amount to empiricism. He invokes Bhaskara and Archer, which is explicitly on Bhaskara and Archer's own terms, not empirical, it's theoretical. And he invokes Elias, which again is a method. You have to come up with a theoretical framework, which you then apply to the data in order to read the data, given your interest in it. But we'll focus here on point 1, the holism claim. Durkheim's holism is marshalled by Scambler as a critique of what is often termed microsociology and to promote recourse to meso and macrosociology. Despite appearances, what the micro versus macro distinction sets up, whether in sociology or social psychology, is not actually a distinction between interactive approaches and structural approaches, as it's generally suggested, but rather a difference in what one thinks analysis of social structure, social norms, and social facts should look like. Approaches which begin with the critique of microsociology formally re-specify the phenomena of the life world as those are experienced by members as methodologically or theoretically generated objects of formal analysis, which thereby exist in the parallel world of the macro social scientist, because only the macro social scientist can see them, given their theoretical lens or their methodological lens. In contrast to this, those interactionists who are often misrepresented as microsociologists are committed to a non-metaphysical, non-theoretical view of social structures as being observable, describable, and analysable in the settings of their production, maintenance, repair, and effects in interaction. Excuse me. Therefore, the place to view not only the production but also the effects of social facts and structures is in interaction. So how do we dissolve the dualism dualism of action and social facts without appealing to some form of exogenous theoretical framework or metaphysics or transcendental argument. And that's where we turn to our discussion of Gestalt phenomena and the way those are inherited in phenomenology and in Wittgenstein. So the resistance to the focus on interaction seems to be based in an underlying dualism of action and social fact, or agency and structure, more generally stated as the dualism of particular and whole, with Durkheimian holism recruited to represent an approach which licenses a focus on social facts, treated as discrete items and requiring particular scientific or theoretical methods. This critique precisely misses the purpose of the turn to a particular type of interactional approach that I'm recommending here, because it ignores the philosophical roots of this interactional approach in 20th century philosophical engagements with Gestalt psychology, and the way this served as a constitutive, existential, or grammatical alternative to transcendental argument. Excuse me. The turn to interaction is taken precisely to dissolve the dualism of action and social fact, agency and structure. Garfinkel's way into this was via what he referred to as a misreading of Aaron Gerwich's phenomenological work on Gestalt phenomena. For those who don't know, Aaron Gerwich, largely forgotten outside of phenomenology, 20th century phenomenological thinker, is kind of usurped by Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger. But he was the first to seriously engage with Gestalt psychology within phenomenology. And Merleau-Ponty attended lectures of Gerwich's, and that's how he came to be familiar with this work. But Garfinkel knew Gerwich and met with him on a regular basis and was influenced by Gerwich's engagement with Gestalt psychology. So that's why we're speaking about this little known phenomenologist rather than maybe some of the more famous ones here. Having said that, I'm going to advocate here switching out Gerwich's phenomenological treatment of Gestalt phenomena for Ludwig Wittgenstein's practice-embedded grammatical treatment. And I'll try and illustrate why as we move on here. The idea is that building on philosophical engagements with Gestalt psychology, we're provided with the resources for dissolving the dualism of particular and whole without invoking transcendental arguments or exogenous frameworks from without that we need to apply onto the data, so to speak. And we are so because our attention is drawn to the internal or grammatical relation between the identity of particular elements and the identity of the whole of which they are a part. This can be carried over to our consideration of the identity of particular actions and the identity of social facts by seeing those acts as constituents of a Gestalt contexture. To illustrate this, we might then paraphrase Gerwich so that we might re-specify his constitutive phenomenological take on Gestalt field so as to render perspicuous the relationship between social fact and action as a Gestalt contexture and its members. So what I'll do is I'll quote Gerwich first. This is a passage from Gerwich's book, Field of Consciousness, where he summarizes his rendition of Gestalt phenomena as constitutive. Okay, so I guess a sort of easy to understand example of this might be when I look at the front of my house, I'm seeing my house from one side, but I see the front of my house, okay? I see it as a constituent of my house and thereby see my house in some genuine sense. I don't simply see 6 windows and a collection of bricks with a door at the bottom, okay? I don't see a wall I see the front of my house, and in characterizing it as the front of my house, I'm characterizing it as a constituent of the whole, which is my house, which I can't see from every aspect at the same time. That's not possible for me. So the key here, the key that Gervich wants to emphasize, is that when you're seeing profiles of a Gestalt or members, for those people that know, in the audience that know ethnomethodology, this is likely where Garfinkel gets the term member from, okay? Because Gervich talks about profiles of a Gestalt as members of the Gestalt, okay? So they are constituents, and we see them as constituents, not just isolated or atomized elements. We see them as constituents, and that therefore removes a dualism of element and whole by saying, no, what we see here are the constituents. We see the elements as constitutive of the whole. So anyway, here's Gervich from Field of Consciousness. You've got this on the slide there. The functional significance of each constituent derives from the total structure of the Gestalt, and by virtue of its functional significance, each constituent contributes towards this total structure and organization. Both formulations are but two expressions of the same state of phenomenal affairs. The functional significance of a constituent of a Gestalt is a genuine phenomenal character and must not be mistaken as secondary or supervenient. So here's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to take this passage and we're going to riff on it and tease it in different directions until we get something we want. So first, we're going to riff on it to take it away from a sort of static Gestalt, such as I illustrated with talk of viewing the front of my house as constitutive of my house. Okay, and we're going to paraphrase it in an active sense as a praxeological Gestalt. Okay, so here the constituents are the actions, okay, of members, and the whole is the social fact. So here's the passage paraphrased in this way. The functional significance of the actions of each member derives from the total structure of the social fact, and by virtue of its functional significance, each constituent member contributes towards this total structure and organization. Both formulations, but two expressions of the same state of phenomenal affairs. The functional significance of a member's actions as a constituent of a social fact is a genuine phenomenal character and must not be mistaken as secondary or supervenient. Okay, so as I say, the people who are familiar with Garfinkel, that will have chimed already. Those that aren't, hopefully you can see this bridge away from the more familiar examples of Gestalts, such as the Gestalt pictures, the famous Gestalt pictures, such as the Rubin vase and the duck rabbit, and profiles of three-dimensional objects, and think of a queue and people queuing, for example. So let's paraphrase this again. Now we're going to paraphrase this to introduce Wittgenstein's grammatical twist on Gestalt phenomena. Now, both Gervich and the Gestalt psychologists didn't want to, they resisted the idea that the relationship between constituents and the whole was a meaning relationship, because they had a particular conception of meaning that meant that it had to be learned through the building of associations, through behavioral repetition. So like a conditioned response mechanism. And they said rightly that if that's how meaning was developed, then the relationship of the elements to the whole, or the constituents to the whole Gestalt, couldn't be that, because you can see the relationship even if you haven't been exposed enough to have built up that relation. But that whole critique of the meaning solution assumed a particular conception of meaning that very few people would subscribe to now. And Wittgenstein is largely seen as the key figure in 20th century philosophy that argues against representative accounts of meaning such as that. So when Wittgenstein in the philosophical investigation shows us a different way of understanding meaning, we can then revisit Gestalt phenomena and try and look at them again. And that's why in Wittgenstein's later manuscripts, he engages with Kohler on Gestalt. Kohler is one of the main Gestalt psychologists. Wittgenstein engages with Kohler on Gestalt phenomena and corrects him and said, look, the relationship is grammatical. So this is what I'm trying to illustrate here with this next reading of this passage from Gervich, but now read grammatically. So the sense of each of the actions of each member derives from the meaning relation with the sense of the social fact, and by virtue of the grammatical relation between the sense of each action and the sense of the social fact. The sense of the constituent member is part of the sense of the whole. Okay, so we're speaking about sense here, or meaning, not function or constitutive features. Both formulations are but two expressions of the same phenomenal affairs. The sense of a member's actions as part of the sense of a social fact is what it is meaningfully identified as, and must not be mistaken as a secondary, projected or supervenient, a matter of interpretation. So for Garfinkel and Wittgenstein, there's an obvious further move to be made, and that is to simply showing the relations in the way of acting and talking as part of ongoing practices that are their home. So Garfinkel undertakes and recommends studies, and Wittgenstein leads one to a point at which one can stop doing philosophy or stop feeling the urge to produce philosophical theses. As Wittgenstein would put it in Philosophical Investigations, when talking about the concept of games and family resemblances, and I'm quoting now, Wittgenstein says, "Don't say they must have something in common or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common to all. For if you look at them, you won't see something that is common to all, but similarities, affinities, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, don't think, but look." This could, what I see here is parallels with Garfinkel. You know, this could be Garfinkel telling us to go, you know, or the transition, for those that know Garfinkel, the transition from the trust paper in the early 60s to studies in ethnomethodology, where the move is away from a sort of more philosophical argument to looking at studies from a way of characterizing a link between rules and applications, to looking and seeing what those links are, what the connections are in particular contexts through studies. So the move here in Garfinkel and Wittgenstein is to get you to look and see what the relationship is, not to theorize or try and provide a general account of the relationship as we found in Gervich and Kohler. To illustrate the move to studies and looking and seeing, we might again adapt the already praxeologically re-specified passage from Gervich once again. Okay. So here's the last version of this Gervich passage that is now almost unrecognizable, I guess. But hopefully you've managed to follow the thread through from what Gervich was originally arguing about constitutive features of Gestalt contextures. So here in the first section on the slide, you've got it stated in general terms, in glossing terms for those who like the Garfinkel and Sachs terminology. So the action sense derives from the internal relation between the action as a meaningful item on this occasion and the social fact as a meaningful item on this occasion. Okay, this is just a way of glossing the following. Okay, so if we were to go and look and see, or go and do a study of this queue, someone might say, yes, I'm waiting in line. I'm queuing. Okay, so the queuing and the waiting in line are grammatically related. Okay, they're internally related. Waiting in line is something one does in a queue. Okay, someone wouldn't know how to use waiting in line in this way if one didn't also know, have grasped the concept of queuing. Okay, and that's why we say they're internally related. To know how to use waiting in line or queuing, we also have to know what a queue is. Okay. So each meaningful action, we're still on this re-specification of the Gurvitch passage here. Each meaningful action gains its identity, is what it is seen as through its relation to the identity of the social fact. The sense a member's action has in its relation to the social fact is its identity, what it is, and must not be mistaken as secondary or supervenient. In other words, seeing someone waiting in line is not secondary or supervenient on something more basic. That is what it is. That is what they're doing. They're waiting in line. They are queuing. So now we've passed from Gurvich's engagement with Gestalt psychology through Wittgenstein and Garfinkel to looking at what people are doing and describing them in ordinary terms that those people would recognize themselves. What I'm proposing is that considering social facts as types of Gestalt serves as a perspicuous way of re-specifying those social facts in such a way as to help us see how the Gestalt contexture is produced through our or interactions as members of the contexture. All this really serves to do is highlight the grammatical relations there in our language, such that, for example, cues involve queuing or waiting in line. What I'm proposing is that we see social facts as a type of Gestalt, specifically a Gestalt contexture, where contexture invokes active production in contrast to passive context. Then, contrary to Gurvitch and Kohler, we follow Wittgenstein when he writes, and I'm quoting Wittgenstein here from his remarks on the philosophy of psychology. Wittgenstein writes, "It is, contrary to Kohler, precisely a meaning that I see." And I take that, what we are seeing are grammatical relations, which are sometimes referred to as internal relations or meaning relations. You find these terms used interchangeably with regards to later Wittgenstein's work. Now I'm going to skip over some more stuff on different types of Gestalt here. I think most people will be familiar with the classic Gestalt drawings. So I'll just jump straight to talking about the difference between a praxeological Gestalt, as interests Garfinkel, and the more traditional types of Gestalts that Gurvitch talked about in his engagement with the Gestalt psychologist. So there are two features of action social fact Gestalt contextures, which we're here calling praxeological Gestalts, which I'd like to draw attention to here. So first, social facts have temporality. They unfold and are extended over time. A cue forms, gets longer, gets shorter. It lives through complete changes in its constituents while remaining the same cue. For example, for the coffee bar at the conference. But it also dies generally at the end of the day as the bar closes, and is reborn the following morning as the coffee bar opens for the day. In this respect, action, social fact, or praxeological gestalts differ from aspect diagrams and pictures, and from profiles and 3D objects. But there is some similarity to melodic gestalts, gestalts of tone, rhythm, and melody, where, for example, you can take found sounds and put in a certain sort of rhythmic structure and tonal structure. They will be heard as a melody. And so you no longer hear the traffic noise as noise disturbing you when you're trying to concentrate, but when it's slowed down and sped up and used in a sort of particular rhythm and tone in the next Radiohead track, all of a sudden you hear it as a melody, you don't hear it as traffic noise. Another example is the opening bar of the Beatles' I Feel Fine, which, if you're familiar with it, you'll hear, as soon as you hear it, you'll hear the melody, but that was a found noise. It was feedback created by them leaning a guitar against an amp. So I'm showing them down with the kids by my references to the Beatles and Radiohead, which I hope everyone's impressed by. So the second point about praxeological gestalts is this. The constituents of action social fact gestalts, or praxeological gestalts, are active and agental, such that their constitutive membership of the gestalt, or the social fact, is a reflexive rather than passive membership. I do queuing through the ethno-methods I employ in joining the queue, retaining my place in the queue, and making accountable my membership of the queue. Note, I can choose not to join the queue, but I cannot choose to wait for the coffee with other people without being in the queue, without queuing. My identity as a queuer is not determined by my intentions, nor my actions considered atomistically. This is why it's sociological and not about individual psychology, for example. Of similar note, I cannot will a queue into being. There must be something to queue for. I must not be able to get what I came for instantly, on demand, and without delay, and so on. There are both material and social constraints on queues and queuing. The sense my actions have as a member of the queue are occasioned, which means they have sense in the context provided by local circumstances. Traditional social psychological or sociological theories overlay a sense conferring formal structure or theory so as to give indexical properties generalizable and discrete sense. The interactional approach I'm recommending here recognizes such a formal structure only in so much as it is ongoingly and endogenously, i.e. internally or immanently, produced as an accomplishment of persons who are members of the community of natural language users, and the way those natural language users orient to the features of the setting and each other. As Garfinkel and Sachs put it in their classic 1970s paper on indexical expressions, on formal structures of practical actions, I'm quoting here, they write, "We offer the observation that persons, in that they are heard to be speaking a natural language, somehow are heard to be engaged in the objective production and objective display of common sense knowledge of everyday activities as observable and reportable phenomena." The key point in all these examples is that while seeing what we see is dependent on the internal relationship between what we see and the concept of the whole, what we see is the constituents as constituents, i.e. the items they are as parts they have in the whole. As Wittgenstein pointed out, this isn't a matter of interpretation, much less cognition. It is a feature of the grammar of our language and our form of life. As Gavitch noted in the quote above, it is not about overlaying the phenomenal character on something thought to be more basic or real. The phenomenal character, the sense, is not secondary or supervenient. For example, I do not see the front elevation of my house as a collection of bricks, glass, and UPVC, and then interpret it, mentally process, or overlay it with phenomenal or conceptual character as the front of my house. I see the front of my house. Its identity as the front of my house is not supervenient on or secondary to its existence as a collection of bricks, glass, and UPVC. Crucially, we see them as members of the Gestalt. That is what they are. I've introduced the notion of action social fact gestalts or praxeological gestalts via cueing and cues because cues are particularly conspicuous examples for explicating praxeological gestalt contextures. However, our topic is acknowledged enacted degradation. So that's what we'll turn to next. So I'm going to skip a bit. I've got a little section here which I'm going to skip for considerations of time, where I argue about, I make a case for Garfinkel licensing a kind of field social psychology or field philosophy even, that's similar to the sort of social psychology or philosophy as examples of the philosopher Frank Ebersole and the sorts of grammatical investigations Wittgenstein engages in. That Garfinkel's studies should be seen as more akin to that than to the sorts of things that mainstream social psychologists do with data or examples, or even experimental philosophers do with data or examples, because we're not using the data as evidence in any way. Okay, we're using them as sort of primers for our thought process. They're like aids to the imagination or ways of bringing to light unseen aspects in grammatical relations. So now I'm going to jump ahead to my case study that I'm going to end with. So this brings us back to the topic of stigma and tries to enact what we've learned through this engagement with Gestalt psychology and through trying to reconstruct Garfinkel's approach by reference to Wittgenstein rather than Gurvitch, which I actually think is not, it's not a correction of Garfinkel. I think Garfinkel, without knowing it, actually did this. I think he ends up much closer to Wittgenstein than to Gurvitch, Merleau-Ponty or Kohler, because of some of the arguments made with Sachs in the 1970 paper. Excuse me. Okay, so here's a case study. A patient, Carolina, visits the doctor for an appointment for breathing problems. The patient is not new to this health centre, but today's doctor, the GP, is new to this patient. The first minute of the consultation has gone without anything of note. Following initial greetings, the exchange is polite and unremarkable. Both patient and doctor seem to be conversing naturally, as would be expected in such a setting, and a rapport seems to be developing. The situation is mundanely social. Two people who've not met before interacting politely so as to communicate effectively. They take turns in speaking, questions elicit answers, and smiles, nods, and audible ums are used to indicate each is listening to the other without interrupting. In addition to being mundanely social, the interaction has some institutionally specific features. It is taking place in a health centre during clinic hours, in the presence of paraphernalia that exhibit this. The room contains an examination table, clinical waste bins. The doctor is wearing an NHS lanyard and ID card. Moreover, the doctor is sat in front of a PC and, as the patient enters, invites the patient to take a seat on a chair adjacent to the PC, and so on. In addition to these situational features, the conversation in and of itself exhibits the difference in roles or membership categories of the two participants. The conversation in its unfolding indicates that one person has experiential authority, that is to say, the patient is the authority on the experience of the symptoms, and this is exhibited in the form that the conversation has, the types of questions the patient asks and the types of questions asked of her. Equally, the conversation indicates that the other party has medical authority. That is to say, the doctor has medical training, which confers authority in this situation on how to interpret the patient's reported experience of the symptoms and arrive at a diagnosis. And this is exhibited in the conversation by the kinds of questions the doctor asked, the kinds of questions asked of her by the patient, and the kinds of answers she provides. The roles or membership categories are co-constituted by the exhibited in the interaction. This segues into our final observation about the situation, and that is that it is goal or achievement oriented. The patient wants a diagnosis and treatment to relieve her symptoms and to understand what it is she's experiencing, while the doctor wants to provide this in the time allotted for the consultation. So 2 minutes into the consultation, things change, and understanding why they do so, making sense of the actions that immediately precede and which take place after the proceedings have taken this turn, will serve as our topic of philosophical investigation and an aid to our imagination. After the opening 2 minutes or so of polite interaction, the doctor, smiling, glances at the screen and then begins to turn as if to re-engage in conversation with Carolina, before appearing to hesitate and returning focus to the screen. The doctor's smile drops momentarily, and she seems to be distracted or absorbed by what she is looking at on the screen, before reinitiating the turning in her chair to face Carolina, the patient. Concurrently, Carolina seemed to notice the doctor was about to re-engage and was therefore preparing for re-engagement herself as the doctor began to turn. Only this re-engagement action was discontinued as she saw the doctor break off to return to the screen. As the doctor turns from the screen the second time and reinitiates the conversation, she once again faces Carolina, smiles and asks, "Do you mind if I take a look at your throat and listen to your breathing?" while at the same time putting on a pair of latex gloves. At this moment, Carolina's the patient, remember. At this moment, Carolina's posture changes. Her smile turns to a frown, her posture becomes withdrawn. There's a slight lean and turn away from the doctor. And she becomes closed. Eye contact is avoided, arms become folded across her chest. And she then appears to become angry, furrowed brow, frown, trembling hands visible as she unfolds her arms. Carolina remarks, "Why are you doing that?" She waits a few seconds. The doctor stutters. Their rapport is broken. For a moment, the doctor hesitates, pausing, putting on the latex gloves, stuttering and not completing her attempt at a verbal response. Before the doctor can compose a response, Carolina picks up her bag and makes to leave the consulting room. The doctor begins to ask, "Is everything?" But interrupting, Carolina remarks, "What do you think?" and leaves the consulting room. So I'll finish by just having a bit of comment on this. Okay. The heading for this section is Seeing an Action Under an Aspect, the meaning of putting on the gloves. The mundane sociality and convivial rapport observable in the first 2 minutes gives way to discordance and trouble. We can observe from the example that Carolina's anger and the social discord was immediately preceded by the doctor's attention being seemingly grabbed by something on the screen, by this causing her to break off an initiated re-engagement, and then by her beginning to put on the latex gloves. What comes after is discordance, because while the doctor seems to proceed as if there's no change in circumstance or no change in the Gestalt contexture, that is, until she registers and reacts to Carolina's reaction, Carolina, from this moment on, acts in a way which suggests circumstances, the Gestalt contexture, have changed for her. So we have 3 actions: an aborted re-engagement in the ongoing conversation is our first action. 2, a visible case of the doctor's attention being grabbed by something on the screen. And 3, the doctor beginning to put on latex gloves while requesting the patient's consent for an examination. It seems safe to make the following observations about these 3 actions. They are mundane, routine, and unremarkable to the doctor at the moment of an action. For the doctor, these actions have nothing about them to set them apart from their other contributions to the interaction prior to that point. The sense they have for the doctor at the point of an action is as routine acts in an unremarkable unfolding of a routine consultation. For Carolina, one or more of these actions seems to be the object of her anger, and therefore the emergent discord, in that they sequentially precede Carolina's reaction in withdrawing. What this means is that one or more of these actions has a different sense for Carolina than for the doctor. That sense makes that, or those actions, objects for Carolina's emotional response. How might the same actions have different senses? Well, this is where we might gesture back to our discussion of praxeological Gestalt contextures. There are two things. One, the relationship between the sense the actions have and the sense of the contexture. And two, the sequential production or weaving of the contexture or ongoing establishment of the rules of the language game through the moves the participants make. For the doctor, her actions have sense in the contexture that is a mundane routine consultation, until Carolina indicates it isn't and introduces trouble into the proceedings. For Carolina, by contrast, the doctor's broken off re-engagement and absorbed focus on the screen indicated a move to a different contexture in which the actions are now reframed by her, Carolina's, HIV status. This sequence of actions were experienced by Carolina almost like the familiar opening to a melody. The contexture for Carolina now splits off from one of a routine consultation and becomes one of HIV-related degradation. Carolina recognizes such interactions. She's seen them before. The doctor's return to an extended focus on the screen was seen by Carolina as being the moment the doctor registered her HIV status in her medical records. This action is followed sequentially by the doctor putting on the latex gloves. This is a routine action for a clinician who is about to examine a patient, that this patient had disclosed their status as a person living with HIV on a previous visit, while also being unaware of the routine and required practice of glove wearing when examining all patients. So the patient saw the action as related to or directed toward their HIV status and felt shame and anger in response. What can we learn from this? Well, if we take degrading someone to be unethical or something best avoided because emotionally harmful, then what we see here is that ethical or emotional harm need not be intentional and need not be constituted by the violation of a moral rule. The patient sees the action under a specific aspect, given their HIV status, what they know about the stigma associated with HIV, and what they know about the persistence of ignorance about HIV transmission, that most people, even some GPs, aren't aware that fully suppressed HIV cannot be transmitted. The patient assumes the glove wearing is because the doctor knows she is HIV positive and is therefore, out of ignorance and prejudice, seeking to protect herself from the patient. The patient sees the putting on of gloves under this aspect as having this sense. The patient sees the doctor putting on gloves as degrading her. The sequence of three actions that culminate in this relate to a newly established Gestalt contexture of establishing new rules and therefore a new language game, where the action of putting on gloves in this language game is seen as putting on gloves as protection from you because you have HIV. That's how it's seen. The doctor sees the putting on of gloves as a routine part of her own medical practice. She is simply putting on gloves for routine examination. The same behavior has different sense. It can be tempting here to ask which comes first, the contexture or the act, but we turn back to our 4 revisions of the passage from Gavitch. So it can be tempting here to ask which comes first, the contexture or the act, the language game or the action as a move within it. But this is the wrong way to see it. Seeing the action as a precautionary act directed at this patient's HIV status rather than a routine act is also to establish a new contexture at the same time. The question as to who has seen the action correctly is academic, because in the world the harm is done. This would be like saying the duck is the correct way of seeing a duck rabbit, but not the rabbit because you have ducks at home, have duck eggs for breakfast, and have never seen line drawings of rabbits before. Sure, these serve to clarify why you see it as a duck, but they do not carry over to general claims about the right way to see the picture. Carolina hasn't seen things incorrectly. This is the way she sees it. Put yet another way, the question of intent is irrelevant to the question of acknowledged enacted degradation. So to finish, we could go into more detail about this example. We could talk about how we might discuss questions about such things as responsibility of the doctor to anticipate and seek to block the emergence of this contexture by always explaining why they are putting on gloves before doing so, or by giving an account as to what took their attention on the screen. If we had AV data, if we had video data, perhaps we could do even more work, though not necessarily, as Patrick Watson's shown in some of his papers. However, the point I want to make is that for something to be enacted degradation, the action needs to have that sense and be acknowledged as such by the person experiencing the degradation. And this is not an interpretation. There's not a question of rightness here. That is how it's seen. It's a social fact. The sense emerges from the internal or the grammatical relationship holding and being acknowledged between the identity of the specific action, which is the doctor putting on gloves as protection against the patient's HIV, and the identity of the Gestalt contexture as an interaction in which one's HIV status is the motive for behaviour. The relationship is established as the actions are, sequentially, reconstituting the Gestalt, and the Gestalt is the pattern or form of which those actions are seen as parts. What we see in acknowledged enacted degradation, discreditation, and discrimination, where the degrading act was not deliberate or intended, can be understood by seeing the divergence of contextures take place in the interaction. To see the emergence of the contexture which enables the degradation or discreditation, one needs to see it from the perspective under the same aspect as the person who is degraded and discredited, to the extent that this is contexture forming. In terms of our talk of this in grammatical terms, you must be alive to the grammatical relations that are in play for the person who has been degraded or discredited. This certainly demands you must see the situation via the concepts available to the participants. It also might mean that you need to have some degree of unique adequacy, such that you see the internal relation between, for example, given our example here, HIV and status degradation. If, for example, you don't, if, a little like the child who doesn't know what a duck is, you think HIV is just a virus like the common cold, and do not know the grammatical relation between HIV and fear, which has been generated over decades by public health messaging which employed fear tactics, then you will be unable to see this grammatical relationship. You won't be alive to this aspect in situations like we've discussed here. And there I'll end because I've gone on far too long. I'm sorry about that.